Well, hello, my name is David Lance. Welcome to this issue of Discovering Truth at the Movies. In this episode of the Chronicles of Belteshazzar, Ezekiel comes to Babylon in order to deliver a message from Jeremiah to Daniel. But before he can find Daniel, he is caught up in a riot caused by two competing gangs of youths. Grandpa explains to the boys why Nebuchadnezzar and Haman would both have their own guards by reminding them of the story of the Three Musketeers. I'll use that to segue into a conversation and ask, how should we respond when circumstances threaten our family and our friends? And so I want to ask you to consider joining me as I read each chapter of the Chronicles of Belteshazzar and provide commentary. I'm going to post the audio files on my podcast, Discovering Truth at the Movies, but I also want you to know that I'm getting ready to publish my book as both a print-on-demand paperback book and as a Kindle ebook. You can go to my website at wisejargon.com/chronicles to learn more about the upcoming book release, The Chronicles of Belteshazzar. And so, having said all of that, why don't we go ahead and jump into this particular chapter 15, Ezekiel visits Babylon. Ezekiel had heard tales of Babylon, but actually seeing the city put all stories of its splendor to shame. Alternating figures of bulls and dragons greeted the caravan to which he attached himself as they entered the gate of Ishtar. On the walls lining the interior of the city, frescoes of lions 20 feet long conveyed the power that was Babylon's. So this was the force God had unleashed to deliver his vengeance. Ezekiel was both terrified at the thought, but thrilled by the knowledge that he was somehow involved in the unfolding chain of events. Because they had no idea what kind of eyes and ears Jehoiakim might have in this city, Jeremiah had instructed him to first seek out Abednego, Meshach, and Shadrach. Most likely, they would be found in the Hebrew quarter of the city. For several hours, he wandered through the city, more out of a desire to explore than because he was lost. Once he came to the Hebrew quarters, he was struck by how clean and seemingly prosperous the new home of his countrymen was. Indeed, it appeared that they had fared even better than those shopkeepers who plied their trade in Jerusalem. After several inquiries, Ezekiel learned that his three friends shared an apartment above the shop of a flask merchant for whom they worked. Close to the edge of the Hebrew quarter, it was near the western side of the Bridge of Heaven. After getting directions from a fish merchant along with his supper, he proceeded to his destination. It would be dark in a few hours, and Ezekiel looked forward to finding his friends very soon. And finally, he came to the intersection where he had been told he would find the flask merchant's shop and his friend's apartment. As he was preparing to walk across the street, shouting erupted a block away. Ezekiel stopped and stared as a fight broke out between a dozen or so youths, some carrying sticks. Giving into his curiosity, Ezekiel began to walk in the direction of the melee. The fight was drawing a crowd, and Ezekiel soon found himself caught up in a riot. Clearly, some of the rioters were Hebrews, but others were individuals from other groups whom he did not recognize. He heard the clamor of horses to his left and turned to see a troop of Babylonian guards ride up and begin to disperse the combatants. Those who resisted were arrested. Ezekiel realized this was the wrong place to be. Deciding to hurry back to his friend's home, he turned to leave and was trapped in a net, being dragged by two Babylonian horsemen. As Ezekiel was pulled along in the dragnet, several others joined him as they too were caught in its path. "Release me! I've done nothing wrong," Ezekiel shouted through the shock and pain of being dragged over the cobblestone street. "Quiet, pig, or we'll cut out your tongue," a soldier cursed at him, taking a swing at Ezekiel with the flat of his sword, missing his head by a fraction of an inch. Ezekiel and his fellow prisoners ceased struggling. It became apparent that those rioters who had not been captured had quickly fled. The soldiers paid the escapees no interest, concentrating only on those they had rounded up. Faintly but distinctly, Ezekiel heard a familiar voice as he lay tangled in the dragnet. "Commander, release that one into my custody. I will vouch for him personally," said the voice of a young Hebrew man. Ezekiel fought against the bindings of the net, craning his neck to get a glimpse of the man It was Shadrach. By whose authority should I do this? Snarled the corporal to whom the request had been made. By the authority of Belteshazzar, chief mage in the court of Nebuchadnezzar, said Shadrach, displaying the brooch of his cloak and with Daniel's insignia, an eagle holding a 7-pronged candlestick. The soldier grumbled but complied with Shadrach's request. Come, Ezekiel, said Shadrach softly as they finished untangling him. Let's get you safely among friends. We have much to discuss. Ezekiel allowed himself to be led away from the scene of the riot to the safety of his friend's home. As you have seen, unrest among the exile groups is growing. Daniel has argued for a forum where leaders of the different groups can meet and discuss their differences, but Haman, Nebuchadnezzar's high priest, has forbidden it. Abednego said as he placed a plate of food in front of Ezekiel, "We await news of the outcome of the attack against Egypt. There is no telling what will happen if the people find that Nebuchadnezzar was defeated. Have you any news, Ezekiel?" Ezekiel chewed and swallowed his bite of food. There had been no news of the battle when I left, though we knew that Babylon was moving against Egypt. He paused to look at his friends before proceeding. He was surprised that they asked of the fate of Nebuchadnezzar instead of their homeland, even of their families. Have you had any word of what is happening back home? We have been most unkind, said Meshach. There must be something of great importance back home. Otherwise, you would not be here, Ezekiel. Tell us about our families and our friends. How is Jeremiah? The three listened to Ezekiel as he told them of their loved ones and the growing apostasy of the people under the reign of Jehoiakim. As the friends spoke, a knock came at the door. Shadrach got up and went to the door. He opened it, and Daniel walked in and embraced his old friend. I came as soon as I heard you were here. God has truly blessed you, said Daniel as he held Ezekiel's shoulders in his hands. Ezekiel gave an abbreviated version of what he had just told the other three. Finally, Daniel looked across at his friend and said, I know that you are here for an important reason. Please tell us what has brought you to Babylon. When we learned that you had been made a mage in the court of Nebuchadnezzar, Jeremiah knew that it must mean the Lord was giving Judah a way to redeem itself. The Lord has shown Jeremiah the death of Jehoiakim, and he has sent me to tell you, Ezekiel said. At the appropriate time, Jeremiah wants you to speak with Nebuchadnezzar and have him place Zedekiah on the throne after him. Daniel began to open his mouth to speak and then thought better of what he wanted to say. Zedekiah was 15 years younger than his half-brother Jehoiakim. Daniel knew that Jeremiah had a fondness for Zedekiah. For years in the court of Zedekiah's father Josiah, Jeremiah had tutored the young prince. Daniel suspected that it was because of that relationship that Jeremiah placed his faith in the young prince. But there also existed a practical political reason for Jeremiah's request. Ever since Josiah had died in his attack on Pharaoh Necho at Megiddo years ago, many had speculated that Jehoiakim had conspired with Egypt to orchestrate his father's death. Therefore, so long as Jehoiakim held the throne of David, he would owe allegiance to his benefactor, Egypt. The same would be true of Jehoiakim's son, Jehoiachin. Daniel realized that Zedekiah didn't have a similar history of allegiance to Egypt. Combined with the prince's tendency to listen to the last advisor to speak with him, it was Daniel's opinion that if Nebuchadnezzar made Zedekiah king of Judah instead of Jehoiachin, Zedekiah would prove to be an unfaithful ally of Babylon. It was for that reason that Daniel didn't believe Zedekiah could prove to be any better a king than Jehoiakim. Having spent nearly 2 years in the court of Nebuchadnezzar, Daniel had come to realize that the agenda of the Lord seldom made it onto the political agenda of mere men. Daniel decided that he did not wish to reveal this difference of perspective with his mentor, at least not yet. When the time comes, I will do as you ask, Daniel finally answered. Ezekiel, as much as I am overjoyed to see you, I ask that you return home at the earliest opportunity. The strife between the exile communities grows, as you witnessed for yourself today. When Nebuchadnezzar returns, I must confront him over the policies of his chief counselor Haman. If this strife is not checked, it will tear Babylon apart. Ezekiel nodded his assent. Daniel smiled, marveling silently at the difference in their relationship since he had left Jerusalem and come to Babylon. When they had parted of the two, Ezekiel had been the leader. Somewhere along the way, he had grown up. In that instant, Daniel realized that reality for what it was. He didn't want the relationship for the responsibility for his people that he knew God was shifting to his shoulders. The last few hours had already loaded his plate with more than he felt he could bear. I will go now. Pressing matters await me in court. Heed my words, Ezekiel, and give everyone back in Jerusalem my love. I will, my friend, Ezekiel said as he hugged Daniel goodbye. Daniel excused himself and left. In the night sky, he saw a full moon overhead. Joining his escort, he climbed into the carriage and prepared for the ride back to the palace. In 2 days, Nebuchadnezzar would return with his defeated army. Riders had arrived only hours ago to advise Daniel of Babylon's defeat at Migdol. He bowed his head and prayed to ask the Lord for guidance in how to serve both his people and the king of Babylon. While the Hebrews would like nothing better than to see the Babylonian Empire collapse, it was Daniel's duty to help to try to preserve it. Not for the first time, Daniel asked his God why he had been placed in this impossible situation. Isaac had listened closely to the story, but there was something that had been bugging him. Finally, he realized what it was. Grandpa, was there really a chief priest named Haman? Isaac, that's a great question. There probably wasn't a Haman exactly, but here's what we do know. We know that during different parts of its history, Babylon had a king who ruled over all the non-religious parts of the kingdom and a chief priest who was responsible for all of the things related to the Babylonian religion, its temples and sacrifices and so on. Also, there were times in Babylonian history when the same person was both the king and the chief priest. But there were also times when the two jobs were done by different people. And when that happened, there could be political fights about who was in charge of what. Now, during the time Nebuchadnezzar was king, there were two different people doing the job of chief priest and king. What do you mean about political fights, Grandpa? Matthew had decided to jump into the conversation. What's the difference between a political fight and a sword fight? Well, sometimes not much, Matthew. Grandpa had a good chuckle at the boy's question. Throughout human history, people who are in charge of things have power over others, and sometimes they try to get even more power for their own greedy uses. That means taking power from others. Grandpa thought for a moment on how he might explain this better to his grandsons, and then hit on an idea. Do you remember watching The Three Musketeers last week? Yeah, that was cool, piped up Josiah. They did lots of sword fighting. Yes, that's right, answered Grandpa. But do you remember who the Three Musketeers worked for? Well, King Louis XIII, promptly replied Isaac. Grandpa smiled and pressed on with his analogy. That's right. But do you remember who they were fighting against? Cardinal Rich, replied Josiah. You mean Cardinal Richelieu, chimed in Matthew, careful to pronounce and emphasize the last part of the cardinal's name. As if a light bulb had just gone off in his head, Isaac supplied the answer to his own question. Hey, a cardinal is a priest, and a pretty important one at that. Richelieu was a chief priest just like Haman. Grandpa beamed at his three grandsons, thankful that they had recently watched The Three Musketeers and that the analogy was still fresh in their minds. Finally, he said, yes, Cardinal Richelieu was actually an evil, greedy man, just like my imaginary chief priest Haman. But there's one other thing. What? Asked Matthew. Scholars. Those are people who have studied this sort of thing a lot. And they say that King Nebuchadnezzar had to put down a revolt in his kingdom sometime between 595 and 592 BC. It was a very serious problem that he faced. How serious? Asked Isaac. Well, to find out, I need to continue the story, said Grandpa. I want to take this moment and offer a personal reflection. When I realized that bringing all these different racial groups together in Babylon would have led to the creation of ethnic enclaves, which in turn would have led to the creation of gangs, I saw an aspect of the story of Daniel that I'd never heard anyone talk about. It made me think back to my teenage years. I got involved with AAU swim team competitions, and this led to my joining the high school swim team and also becoming a certified lifeguard. I worked for 4 summers, most of high school and some of college, as a lifeguard at the local public pool where I lived in Goshen, Indiana. Goshen is the heart of Elkhart County, which is the RV capital of America. Lots of recreational vehicles, campers, mobile homes, and boats are made in the factories there. Over the years, a steady influx of Hispanics came to where I lived. At one point in the early 2000s, some 36% of the residents in Elkhart County were Hispanic. That was, at that time at least, the largest concentration of the Hispanic ethnic group in the state of Indiana. One summer, it led to a rumble at a place called Rogers Park, and I found myself there with perhaps 60 other teens for what could have turned into an all-out fight between the white kids and the Hispanic kids. It was not something that I wanted to do, but felt it was my duty to show up to support my friend, Eric. It seems there was an argument over a girl involving Eric and a boy from the Hispanic group named Victor. The details, if I ever really knew them to begin with, are lost to me now some 40 plus years later. Essentially, the rules were that the two main guys would fight, but if anyone from either side jumped in, we would all jump in. Thank goodness the fight stayed between the two. My friend Eric got the worst end of the deal, but there were no lasting injuries. Were the same scenario to play out in the year 2021, I'm sure things would be much worse. In those days, we all still had some semblance of honor and fair play. I recall that while both sides were waiting for Eric and Victor to show up, a friendly game of basketball was played by the guys from both sides. After all, this was Indiana, where every boy, at least in those days at least, seemed to have been born with a basketball in his crib. I suspect many of the guys on both sides were there for the same reason I was, a manner of honor and a desire not to be thought a coward who would not show up to stand with his group. If you've never watched some version of the movie, The Three Musketeers, I encourage you to do so. In the case of the Musketeers, they are outnumbered and outgunned by the guards of Cardinal Richelieu. And yet, against all odds, they fight together to honor their creed, all for one and one for all. That is the enticement of the gang in any age and in any language. Our job as parents and grandparents is to help our young people navigate the pitfalls that await an unsuspecting young person when the crowd attempts to pull them into the dark side of their schemes. We want to guide them so that they will join a group or groups that have a noble cause with honorable aspirations. A group like the Three Musketeers, of which there were actually 4, would be one such. Imagine Athos, Porthos, Aramis, and D'Artagnan as they are surrounded by a squad of Richelieu's guards. And Aramis says, "The merit of all things lies in their difficulty. And now, gentlemen, all for one, one for all. That is our motto, is it not?" Well, this leads to our question for reflection. When circumstances threaten our family and friends, what is our responsibility to them? Well, I hope that you've enjoyed this edition of the Discovering Truth at the Movies and this chapter of the Chronicles of Belteshazzar. If you go to my website at wisejargon.com/@the-movies, you can sign up for my newsletter, Conversations with the Culture. You can also go to my podcast at davidlance.podomatic.com. And just remember that hopefully sometime in the second half of the month of September, I'll be coming out with my new book, The Chronicles of Belteshazzar. Well, until next time, thanks so much and God bless.